Chapter 19. Who Controls Coincidences? Right from the very first appearance of the Anastasía book, there have been quite a number of articles written by various scholars on the Anastasía phenomenon. Many of them included references to me. Whenever I heard or read unflattering remarks about myself, even if they temporarily upset me, it wasn't for long, maybe a day or two, a week at the most. My insides would get stirred up a bit, but then it was history. But this time, at a meeting in Moscow, one of my readers handed me an audio cassette. He said it was a recording of a talk given at an academic conference by the leader of a scholarly research group, which was studying the Anastasía phenomenon. I listened to the cassette a few days later. What I heard was beyond belief. Its message, once it had sunk in, not only knocked me off the rails, it seemed it was going to do me in for good. Really do me in, especially in my own self-esteem. Before listening to it, I was planning to head off again to the taiga to see Anastasía and my son, but after hearing it, I put my plans on hold. Here's what I heard, slightly abbreviated. My respected colleagues, I should like to present you with some of the conclusions and arguments worked out by a research group I head on the basis of over 3 years investigating the phenomenon we shall call Anastasía. In my report, I shall use the name Anastasía not just for the sake of convenience, but because the subject of our investigation has presented itself under that name. This does not rule out the possibility of giving it a more specific and characteristic definition in the future. It is difficult to do that at the moment, since I am persuaded that we are dealing with something that surpasses the boundaries of traditional academic disciplines, and possibly modern science on the whole. We begin by defining 3 research questions. A. The truthfulness of the events described by the author Vladimir Megré in his book. B. Megré's book themselves. And C. Public reaction to Megré's books. By the end of the first 6 months, it was clear that the truthfulness or untruthfulness of the events described in the book was an irrelevant question. The wild, emotional reaction of most readers who have had contact with Megré's books has nothing to do with whether the events described are real or not. Public reaction is determined by a different set of factors entirely. However, the time and resources and intellectual potential we have spent pursuing this question led to what is, in my opinion, a rather interesting conclusion. Namely, that the tendency of individuals, including psychologists and academic circles in general, to cast doubt on Anastasía's existence, is in fact a contributing factor to the very phenomenon we are studying. It is this very hoopla surrounding the question, does she or doesn't she exist, that has enabled the phenomenon to penetrate unhindered into all levels of society today. The denial of the existence of Anastasía has actually served to neutralize any opposition to her designs. If she doesn't exist, after all, then it follows that there is no object to study, nothing to oppose. On the other hand, the public reaction to Anastasía's sayings attests to the vital necessity of research to determine her significance and the intellectual capabilities. As to the truthfulness of the events set forth in the books, we can state the following. In describing these events, the author not only presents himself under his own name, but does not shield anyone else connected with these events. He makes no effort to change the real names of the people or places, or to cover up embarrassing facts about himself. For example, the episode described in the first book where Megré, in the presence of the captain, flirts with the local country girl visiting the ship during a pleasure cruise, has been fully documented as fact. Crew members have also confirmed the presence that evening of a quiet and taciturn young woman with a kerchief tied around her head. Megré showed this woman around the ship, then spent some time alone with her in his cabin. From the book we learn that this was the first appearance of the Siberian recluse Anastasía on Megré's lead ship, the one that served as his headquarters. It was the entrepreneur's first encounter with the Siberian recluse and their first conversation together. The chronology of many of the events described in the book has been confirmed by documents and eyewitness accounts. Not only that, but other situations even more extraordinary have come to light, which the author, for one reason or another, did not describe in his books. A notable case in point is Megré's stay in Novosibirsk City Hospital, where medical records indicate the progress of his illness, medical test results, the prolongation of his illness, and his remarkable recovery. We have determined that his recovery immediately followed the doctor's application of cedar oil which was left at the hospital by an unidentified woman. I shan't deny that, carried away as we were in our pursuit of the truth of the events described in the book, and with access to criminological facilities, for example, we were in a position to prove or disprove a great deal. We were halted in this pursuit, however, by the public's wild and extraordinary reaction to Megré's books, or more specifically to Anastasia's sayings therein recorded. The details of Megré's intimate relations were not a drawing card for most people. They were excited instead by Anastasia's monologues. Even our initial investigations of this reaction, and especially its latest manifestations, clearly indicated that something calling itself Anastasia is exercising an unmistakable influence on today's society. Her sphere of influence continues to increase in size even today, and we need to pay greater attention to even the most improbable arguments. Try to discern them and follow them up. In all probability, the phenomenon known as Anastasia possesses powers and abilities which our mind and consciousness are not in a position to fully make sense of. In Megré's first book, in the chapters entitled Across the Dark Forces Window of Time, the phenomenon predicts not only the appearance of the book, but also how and by what means she will capture people's minds and consciousness. In her monologue, Anastasia affirms that she has collected from various ages the best combinations of sounds to be found in the universe, and that they will have a positive influence on people. She affirms that this action is quite simple. As you can see, it is simply a matter of translating the combinations of signs from the depth of eternity and infinity of the universe, exact in sense, meaning, and purpose. Our group as a whole reached a unanimous conclusion. This particular saying is an invention. This conclusion was based on the following logical and, as we believed, irrefutable argument. Even if certain unusual combinations do exist in the book, then they cannot exercise any influence over the reader, since there is no instrument to reproduce them. The book cannot utter sounds, and consequently cannot convey to our hearing the sounds of the universe, said to have been collected by Anastasia. Later, however, Anastasia did give the following answer. You are right, a book does not make sounds, but it can serve as a score, like a musical score. The reader will involuntarily utter within himself any sounds he reads. Thus, the hidden combinations in the text will resonate in the reader's soul in their pristine form with no distortion. They are bearers of truth and healing, and they will fill the soul with inspiration. No artificial instrument is capable of reproducing what resonates in the soul. In his third book, The Space of Love, Megré sets forth Anastasia's dialogue with the scholars, but for some unknown reason he abbreviates it. Or, if we assume that the phenomenon itself participated in the book's appearance, then it is possible that it deliberately omitted the continuation of Anastasia's response to the scholars. What for? Possibly to leave the unbelievers in their state of inaction. The fact remains that the proofs of Anastasia's incredible declarations do exist. Here is the continuation of Anastasia's dialogue with the scholars. To her adversary's statement that the blending within man of certain sounds not part of human speech has never been anywhere established as fact, Anastasia replied as follows. It has been established, and I can give you an example. But it must be an example everybody can relate to. Fine. Ludwig van Beethoven. What about him? His Ode to Joy. That was the name he gave to his 9th symphony. It was written for a symphony orchestra and mass choirs. Okay, but how can that prove your statement about the evocation of sounds within the reader's mind, sounds that nobody's ever heard. Sounds evoked within the mind of the reader of a book are heard by the reader alone. There, you see, by the reader alone. That means there's no proof, and your example with Beethoven's symphony isn't convincing. At the time he wrote his Ninth Symphony, Ode to Joy, Ludwig van Beethoven was deaf, responded Anastasía. This fact is attested by Beethoven's biographers. Not only that, but the deaf composer himself conducted the first performance of his symphony. In the light of this particular historical fact, Anastasía's next saying no longer raised any doubts. Every letter or combination of letters from any text being uttered can be transformed into sound. A page of text can be compared to a page from a musical score. It is simply a question of who is able to set forth the note letters and how. Will they comprise a great symphony or simply audible chaos? And another question, does everyone have an instrument of sufficiently high quality within themselves to reproduce the full orchestration? The researchers in our group subsequently came to the following conclusion. Anastasía's sayings in respect to the derivations of explosion, transportation by creating a vacuum, purification of the air, agrotechnical methods, the significance of cedar oil in the treatment of many diseases, the energy of man-produced thought, as well as many other phenomena, deserve the most meticulous study by scientific circles. In arriving at this conclusion, our group does not make any claim to be the first to discover it. Scholars in Novosibirsk came to it at the same time or even a little ahead of us, as may be seen in a presentation by the leader of the Novosibirsk Scholars Circle, Sergei Speransky, in a published paper entitled, It's More Useful to Believe. The Novosibirsk psychologist Nina Sukitova came up with the following conclusion on the basis of her sociological research. One's relationship to Anastasía is not dependent on the presence or absence of academic degrees, but very much depends on a man's character, his scale of values, on his conscious and subconscious mindset, i.e., on a man's personality and all its elements. It depends on whether this man wants Anastasía to be real or not. It depends on how open a man's consciousness is, on the degree that it is ready to accept amazing phenomena that go beyond the bounds of commonality. What is revealed to us and how? This depends on the characteristics of our time and corresponds to the level of our own self-awareness. Possibly the Novosibirsk researches could have gone even farther than ours, but the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences declined to finance them. Today, our group, having received a commission and consequently prearranged funding, is already in a position to state with confidence and the support of evidence the following fact. Our civilization has witnessed a phenomenon never before subject to scientific measurement, nor, consequently, to scientific definition. Our research must attract not only representatives of modern scientific disciplines, especially physicists and psychologists, but esoterics too. The process taking place in our society today under the influence of the Anastasía phenomenon are evident and actual, and we cannot, in fact, we do not even have the right to leave them unstudied. Some of the events described in Megré's books indeed look like fiction at first glance, and we have endeavored to treat them with skepticism. Nevertheless, the subsequent events that happened to the author, but are not described in the books, are even more incredible. But the incredible has happened, and we find ourselves obliged to draw conclusions which are difficult even for us to believe. One of these conclusions is that Vladimir Megré does not exist, and that there's no point in studying his biography for an explanation of what has happened. What appears at first glance to be a rather far-fetched conclusion removes and explains a whole host of improbabilities. Namely, how did it happen that an ordinary Siberian entrepreneur suddenly became capable of writing a book? A series of books, now which has become one of the most popular in Russia. The speculations put forth in the press upon closer inspection turn out to be unfounded. A bankrupt entrepreneur decides to settle his affairs by becoming a writer. But we have a lot of bankrupt entrepreneurs, yet not one of them has ever become a famous writer. He managed to think up a sensational storyline, but the storyline has nothing to do with it. Our esoteric press does nothing but publish sensational stories about unusual phenomena, week after week, super healers, flying saucers, and aliens. Yet the public hardly bats an eyelid, and these stories are prepared by professional writers and journalists. Megré's books have a powerful publicity engine working for them. Just the opposite, many publications are now trying to promote themselves on the back of Megré's books. We have established beyond a doubt that Megré's first 3 books were published without even any exposure in bookstores. Not by a publishing firm with a large distribution network, but by a Moscow print shop number 11, which doesn't deal in the book trade at all. And yet here people have been standing in queue for Megré's books, and wholesalers have been paying advances up front to carry them, even before they're published. In the minds of many book dealers, the popularity of Megré's books flies in the face of all book business norms, and goes against experts' predictions concerning consumer demand. So what is the result? Did Vladimir Megré miraculously become a genius out of the blue? Nothing miraculous about it. I repeat, Vladimir Megré, the entrepreneur who was well known in Siberia, simply does not exist today. Evidence in support of this argument may be found through a careful reading of Anastasia's sayings back in the first book. Let's recall her words addressed to Vladimir. You will write this book, guided only by feelings and your heart. You will not be able to do otherwise, since you have not mastered the technique of writing, but through your feelings you can do anything. These feelings are already within you, both mine and yours. Note carefully Anastasia's last words cited here. These feelings are already within you, both mine and yours. This means that Vladimir Megré's own sense perception of the world has been supplemented with that of Anastasia's. We shall not examine how and by what means this supplementing was effected. We shall accept it as a fact which engenders the following logical conclusion. If to one defined magnitude another is added, then the aggregate of the 2 magnitudes engenders a third independent magnitude. Hence, the present Megré's date of birth cannot be determined by the date registered on his official birth certificate. There is more justification in considering his birth date to be in 1994, i.e. the moment he met Anastasia. Even though the outward appearance of the new individual corresponds to the former Megré, the radical difference between the two is all too apparent. This includes, for example, both his literary talent and his ability to hold an audience's attention for an extended period of time. 5 hours or more, as has been twice attested by witnesses to his appearance at a readers' conference in the city of Gelendzhik, in the Krasnodar region. This fact is reflected in accounts in a number of national magazines. Many researchers and journalists have got caught up in comparisons and investigation of events connected with the activities of Vladimir Megré, just on the basis of the description in the books. They have been attempting to prove, either subconsciously or openly and aggressively, that this cannot be so. My dear colleagues, I am inclined to believe, and not without some justification, that the following communications will convince you that such a feeling is nothing more than a defense mechanism found in those whose mind or consciousness is incapable of making sense of what's really going on. Vladimir Megré himself, or more accurately, part of his own self, is even less capable than that of making sense of the events he's involved in. It is just that he has gradually become accustomed to them, and is beginning to categorize even the most incredible phenomena as normal or commonplace, which has also served to keep him from having a nervous breakdown. I think that, like many readers, he did not pay any special attention to what Anastasia said to him back at that first meeting with him in the taiga. When Megré protested, "I shan't even make an attempt to write anything," Anastasia responded, "Believe me, you shall. They have already created a whole network of circumstances that will make you do this." This dialogue is given right in Book 1, but in Megré's subsequent books there isn't even an attempt to return to this question. Who, in fact, are these mysterious they? Upon receiving specific information, the members of our group once more delved into the dialogues reproduced in the first book to select all the references to this they scattered over its pages. I shall cite these references in Anastasia's words. If it had not been for them, and for me too, a little, your second expedition would have not been possible. I want you to be purified. That is why I thought back then about your trip to holy places, about the book. They have accepted this, and the forces of darkness are always fighting with them, but never have the dark forces scored a major victory. My plan and conscious awareness were precise and realistic, and they accepted them. They are answerable only to God. The following conclusion can be drawn from Anastasia's sayings. Some indeterminate forces will set in place for Megré some kind of network of circumstances compelling him to carry out actions somebody's pre-programmed for him. And if that is so, then Megré's role as an individual in his creations amounts to nil, or at least something very insignificant. Everything is simply being handed to him on a platter through this network of supposedly coincidental circumstances. This also means that the individual of the past known as Megré has evidently been violated. We decided that if we succeed in establishing certain anomalies in Megré's behavior, or rather the presence of a network of circumstances or so-called coincidences, such a presence could confirm or disapprove A. the reality of what's happened in the taiga, B. the degree of participation of Megré as an individual in the events taking place in society surrounding the publication of his books, and C. the existence of some kind of forces capable of producing coincidences influencing man's destiny. The episode in Megré's life, which we have managed to examine in the greatest detail right down to the individual nuances, is his behavior on Cyprus in June 1999, during the time when he was working on his fourth book, Co-Creation. It would even be more accurate to say that he was in the process of figuring out the meaning of his dialogues with Anastasía, which he had already transcribed, about the creation of the earth and the man. What we discovered on Cyprus can only be summed up in one short phrase. What is it? Let me acquaint you with the certain events that took place there. At the end of May 1999, Vladimir Megré took a Transavia flight to Cyprus, but not as a member of a tourist group. There was nobody he knew on Cyprus. He did not know any of the languages spoken on the island. The Cyprus travel agency Leptos placed this individual Russian tourist in a single room on the second floor of a small hotel. The room had a balcony overlooking a fair-sized pool, where tourists, mainly from England and Germany, would lounge around and have fun. Megré's Russian travel agent had informed the manager of Leptos that this particular tourist was a Russian writer, but that was hardly news to a major travel firm like Leptos, accustomed to hosting world-famous celebrities. As far as they were concerned, Megré was just an ordinary tourist. Nevertheless, on the second day of his stay, he was approached by the senior company manager responsible for the Russian tourist market with an offer to show him around the city, including the estates the company itself had developed. They brought along a Russian-speaking interpreter employed by the firm. I'm now going to quote, my friends, from a transcript of the statement provided to us by the Leptos interpreter, Marina Pavlova, during an interview. I accompanied Nikos, the manager of Leptos, and Megré, and interpreted during their conversation. Megré distinguished himself from most Russian tourists by his uncompromising attitude, which bordered on tactlessness. For example, we were standing on a mountain with a terrific view of the sea and the city of Paphos. Nikos was giving the usual spiel. Look at all this natural beauty around us. What a fantastic view. I translated the sentence, but Megré responded, It's a depressing view. Nice and warm, the sea, but look, all the vegetation's all stunted. Just an occasional bush here and there, so unnatural in a climate like this. Nikos began to explain. Earlier, the island was covered with cedar forests, but when the Romans invaded, they cut down the forests to build their ships. Besides, there's very little rainfall here. To which Megré retorted, "The Romans were here many centuries ago. Over that time, new forests could have grown up, but you have not been planting them." Nikos tried to explain that there is very, very little rainfall on the island, and even drinking water must be collected in special reservoirs. But Megré sharply responded, "There is no water because there is no forest, and the wind carries the clouds on past the island. If there were a forest, it would slow down the movement of the lower air currents as well as the movement of the higher altitude clouds. It would rain more often on the island. I think the reason they don't plant a forest is that they're trying to sell all the land for development." Having said this, Megré turned aside and became lost in a thought. We didn't say a word. An oppressive pause hung over us. There was nothing anyone could say. The next day, as we were having lunch at a cafe, Nikos inquired as to what he might do to make Vladimir's stay more comfortable. Megré replied in all seriousness, "There should be more Russian spoken on the island. The restaurants should serve proper fish instead of some kind of perch. The hotel rooms should be quieter. Besides, I'd rather have a forest around me than people who smile when they don't mean it." Then there was the meeting between Megré and the head of the Leptos agency. How this came about, I have no idea. The CEO has never met with any tourists in person, and even many of his employees have never seen his face. I was present at the meeting as an interpreter, but even here Megré said the company should change the layout of the sites where it was constructing its new estates. Each site should be no less than a hectare in size, a place where people can plant trees and look after them. And that way the whole island will be transformed. If this doesn't happen, it will be long before the island becomes it won't be long before the island becomes an undesirable tourist destination, and Leptos will see a significant decline in business. After a moment's pause, the CEO began expounding with considerable aplomb on the island's legendary tourist sites and the most famous site of all, the baths of the goddess Aphrodite. He concluded by offering Megré an opportunity to suggest anything that might make his stay more comfortable. While the CEO of the Leptos might have been able to satisfy the wishes of many Western millionaires, what Megré said to him in response completely threw him for a loop. It sounded like a joke, as though Megré were making fun of him. Megré, in all seriousness, replied, "I need to meet with the granddaughter of the goddess Aphrodite." I tried translating this sentence as a joke, but nobody laughed. The shock of the remark left everybody speechless. By and by, news of this Russian tourist's eccentricities reached the ears of the hotel staff where Megré was staying, and they began to make fun of him. Nikos told me in conversation that there was something abnormal in Megré's behavior. Nikos and I made regular morning visits to the hotel on administrative matters, and each time Nikos would jokingly ask the clerk on duty at the main desk whether Aphrodite's granddaughter had checked in yet. The clerk would laughingly respond that she hadn't arrived yet, but there was always a room waiting for her. Megré evidently felt the mocking glances of the hotel staff whenever he came down to the bar from his room in the evening or to breakfast in the morning. It seemed to bother him. As a Russian, I too felt uncomfortable about seeing my fellow countryman being ridiculed, but there was no longer anything I could do. On the morning of the last day of Megré's scheduled stay on Cyprus, Nikos and I went to the hotel as usual. Nico wanted to say goodbye to Megré. Once again, he greeted the desk clerk with his customary jocular inquiry, but this time the clerk's unusual response was not forthcoming. The clerk, in a rather emotional frame of mind, told Nikos that Megré had not spent the night in his room and was not in the hotel at the moment. He went on to report, in all seriousness, without even a hint of a smile, that the evening before Aphrodite's granddaughter had come to the hotel in a motor car and collected Megré along with his things. She had told the clerk on duty in Greek that there was no need to be concerned, that Megré would not be returning to the hotel, and so his room could be reassigned as needed. and that they need not bother booking Megré's return flight to Moscow. She also asked them to tell Nikos that she would bring Megré to the hotel at 10 o'clock the next morning to say goodbye. The clerk repeated that Aphrodite's granddaughter had talked with the whole hotel staff in Greek, but with Megré in Russian. Without a clue as to what was going on, Nikos and I seated ourselves in two of the comfortable armchairs in the lobby and silently waited for the appointment hour to arrive. At 10 o'clock on the dot, the big glass doors of the main entrance swung open, and we saw Vladimir Megré accompanied by a beautiful young woman. I had seen her before. She was Elena Fadeyeva, a Russian who lived and worked on Cyprus as a representative of a Moscow travel firm. I told you I recognized her, but not right away. This particular morning, Elena Fadeyeva looked exceptionally beautiful. Wearing a long, lightweight dress, she sported an attractive hairdo and had a cheery sparkle in her eyes. The slender young woman accompanying Megré immediately drew the attention of the hotel staff in the lobby. Bartenders, maids, and clerks froze in their tracks, their eyes fixed on the approaching pair. In talking with them, Nikos and I learned that Megré had decided to extend his stay on Cyprus by a month. When Megré temporarily withdrew to see about something at the bar counter, Nikos remarked on Megré's fussiness, saying he was making demands which neither he nor the Leptos CEO could possibly fulfill. Whereupon Elena responded, "I have fulfilled all his wishes. I think I shall be able to fill any others, too, that may arise." Nikos continued to question Elena as to how she would be able to do the impossible in just 12 hours. How could she make Megré's favorite Siberian freshwater fish appear on Cyprus, or cause cedars to grow on the island in just 12 hours, or make all the Cypriots suddenly be able to understand Megré speaking Russian? Where could she have found a place for him to stay where nobody could interrupt the solitude he so desired? Elena replied that everything Megré needed just simply appeared as though by coincidence. She put Megré up at her own villa, which just happened to be vacated at the right moment. The villa was located not far from Paphos at the edge of the village of Paia, where nobody could possibly disturb him. She provided him with transportation by hiring a motor scooter especially for him. It turned out that her Russian friend Alla, who was also working on Cyprus, just happened to have some Siberian freshwater fish on hand, and cedars grow on a hillside not far from her villa. Besides, Megré had brought with him 2 little Siberian cedars, and she put them in pots right at the villa's entrance. The language barrier would present no further problem for Megré, since there are telephones in all the places he wants to visit, including shops and cafes. And she always has her mobile phone with her, and that way she can interpret for Megré whenever necessary, i.e. whenever he has something he wants to say to someone. As Elena and Vladimir were already making their way toward the door under the fixed stares of everyone present, I reminded Nikos that he had forgotten to ask how Elena would be able to fulfill Megré's request concerning the granddaughter of the goddess of Aphrodite. Nikos looked at me in surprise and replied, "If that Russian girl isn't the living embodiment of Aphrodite, or her granddaughter, then for certain the spirit of Aphrodite is present in her at this moment." My dear colleagues, after hearing Marina Pavlova describe these events of Vladimir Megré's life during his stay on Cyprus, the question naturally arose, whence came this chain of coincidences which fulfilled all Megré's stated demands in the blink of an eye? Was it really just coincidence, or was someone like Anastasía or the mysterious they she talks about somehow shaping these coincidences? Note how immediately after the people around Megré at his hotel began to wonder what was going on, a situation turned up to remove him from the curious observer's field of vision. He retired to Elena Fadeyeva's villa. As far as the people back at the hotel were concerned, this ended the unusual chain of coincidences, but we wondered whether it had really come to an end, and so we reconstructed subsequent events in as much detail as we could, thanks to the help of what we were told by both Fadeyeva personally and by people who know her. And what did we learn? It turned out that not only did the series of extraordinary coincidences not stop, but they became even more mysterious. I'll cite just a few excerpts from our records. So, here we have Vladimir Megré staying all by himself in Farevia's small but cozy villa. He was most probably in the process of deciphering Anastasia's sayings about God, about the creation of the earth and man's destiny. He had just finished working on this part of the book, but he didn't understand everything himself yet, and true to his nature, before publishing the book he wanted to find somewhere, or in something, at least a modicum of confirmation of Anastasia's unusual sayings. From time to time he would ring up Elena and ask her to come and see him, to take him somewhere in the car. And each time the young woman would drop whatever she was doing at the moment to fulfill Megré's request, even if it meant reneging on a commitment to greet people arriving from Russia. Twice she had to reassign her duties to one of her colleagues, losing part of her income in the process. So where did Megré go? We established that, apart from the usual tourist spots, he paid a visit to 2 churches, which none of the other tourists went to, along with a monastery not on the tourist circuit, and a vacant castle in the Troodos Mountains. On several occasions he climbed the ridge not far from Fedia's village. He would take solitary walks among the cedars growing in the ridge while Elena waited for him down by the road. We were also able to establish that all Megré's visits to the churches and the monasteries were spontaneous, i.e. not planned in advance. More specifically, they formed part of the same chain of coincidences. Here's what Elena Fadevna told us about Vladimir Megré's nighttime visit to one of the churches. I went to see Vladimir at around 9 p.m., directly after he called. He told me he simply wanted to go for a ride around the city. He got into my car and we headed for Paphos. Vladimir seemed absorbed in his own thoughts and scarcely offered a word of conversation. As we drove for about an hour or so, as we passed by all the cafes along the embankment, I suggested we stop for something to eat, but he declined. When I asked where he would like to go, he said he felt like visiting some vacant church. I turned the car around and headed full speed, I'm not sure why I was in such a hurry, to a little village. I knew there was a church there that hardly anybody visits. We drove right up to the entrance and got out of the car. Not a soul around. The nighttime silence was broken only by the roar of the waves. We walked up to the main door. It was dark, but just below the door handle I could feel a large key sticking out. I turned it and opened the door. Vladimir went in and for a long time stood in the middle of the floor below the dome. I stayed by the entrance. Then Vladimir went through the archway the priests come out of and must have lit a candle or something. Anyway, something there began emitting a bright glow and the whole church interior brightened a bit. I stood for a while longer and then went out to the car. Some time later Vladimir appeared and we left. Here's the second incident Fadevya told us about. I wanted to show Vladimir a village way out in the country so he could see how the local people lived. There were so many turns going off the mountain road we were traveling, and somehow, probably by mistake, I took a wrong turn. Since instead of ending up at the village, we presently found ourselves in front of the gates to a little monastery. Vladimir wanted to go in at once and asked me to go with him to interpret with the monks, but I said I couldn't. I was wearing a rather short skirt and had no head covering, and that's not permitted in a monastery, so I stayed outside. I watched as Vladimir walked across the courtyard. All at once he noticed a young monk in front of him. They stopped face to face each other and began conversing. Then they came over to me. I could hear the young monk speaking with Vladimir in Russian, and presently Vladimir was approached by an older gray-haired man, the Father Superior, and the two of them sat and talked for the longest time on one of the benches in the courtyard. The monks and I were standing a little distance away, and we couldn't hear what they were talking about. Then the Father Superior and the monks gathered to see us off. But on his way out the gate, Vladimir stopped, and everybody else stopped too. Vladimir turned and headed across the courtyard to the church. Nobody followed him. We were still waiting at the gate when he came out of the vacant monastery church. And so the chain of coincidences continued. Just to remind you, Vladimir Megré was working on deciphering what Anastasía had said about God. Was it just a coincidence that at the very moment when he wanted to visit a vacant church, there at his side, coincidentally, was Elena Fadevya, who just happened to know about such a church? Was it just a coincidence that the key was sticking out of the door of the vacant church? Was it just a coincidence that Elena made a wrong turn and ended up taking Megré to a monastery hardly anybody goes to? Was it just a coincidence that he encountered a Russian-speaking monk? We are dealing here with a chain of events, real-life situations, practically a series of seeming coincidences, sequentially arranged, all leading to some kind of predetermined end. Now that we know about such coincidences, can we still talk about the philosophical conclusions Megré comes to in his books as being purely random or coincidental? Perhaps it was in some of these churches where Megré, as we now know, stood alone under the dome, that God's words became consolidated in his mind, afterward to appear in his fourth book, Co-Creation. Time and again we have tried to trace in detail the sequence of the coincidences surrounding Megré. Among a great many others, there was one that interested us in particular, namely, how Megré just happened to meet Elena Fadevya. We shan't speculate as to whether this young woman was actually imbued with the spirit of the goddess of Aphrodite. We'll leave such speculation to esoterics. But let's consider just why this girl dropped what she was doing at the very first call and rushed to Megré's side, made him borscht and carted him around Cyprus in her motor car. Why did she change so radically even in her appearance after meeting Megré? Why did her eyes suddenly begin to sparkle upon meeting Megré, as claimed by many people who knew her? Perhaps it was just from meeting a celebrity, but as a representative of a travel agency affiliated with Moses Strada, Elena gets to meet much bigger celebrities than Vladimir Megré. Money, perhaps? But Megré couldn't have had much money. Otherwise, he would have booked into a 3-star hotel to begin with. There is only one conclusion to be drawn from all this. Elena Fadevya fell in love with Megré. This is confirmed by something she said to one of her acquaintances, when the acquaintance asked her, "Well, Lena, you haven't fallen in love with this Megré chap?" Elena responded, "I don't know. It's a rather strange feeling, but if he asked me..." And so we have yet another incredible coincidence before us. Here's a 23-year-old woman, slender, warm, and outreaching, independent and pragmatic, not lacking a fair share of attention on the part of many men around her, suddenly falling in love at first sight with a 49-year-old man. I think you will agree that such coincidences are extremely rare indeed. We've tried analyzing in still greater detail, even moment by moment, the first meeting between Vladimir Megré and Elena Fadevya. We spoke with the employees at the Maria Cafe who witnessed it firsthand. From what we are told by Elena herself and by people who know her, we have reconstructed the day of that meeting. As a result, we have been presented with yet another coincidence. But this time, what a coincidence! It could explain Elena falling in love with Megré a few times before she met him for the first time. A kind of coincidence that can have an effect on both man's consciousness and his subconscious simultaneously. Picture to yourself Elena Fadevya driving her car on the way to the Maria Cafe in a resort town. One of the waiters had rung her up and asked her to come to the cafe, if at all possible, as there was a Russian man sitting at one of the tables and getting very nervous. The cafe's sign featured its name in Russian, as well as names of Russian dishes, all of which promised a Russian-speaking waiter. But, as it turned out, this person did not happen to be on the premise at the time. Elena at first declines, but then a little break happens to come up in her work, so she gets into her car and heads for the cafe where some kind of Russian man is waiting. Along the way, she takes care to powder her sun-tanned nose, picks an audio cassette at random, and slips it into the player in her car. The car speaker fills the interior with the words and melody of a Russian popular song. I'm now going to remind you of the words of that song, and you, my dear colleagues, can draw your own conclusion. Here are the words Elena heard resonating from her car speakers just moments before her encounter with Megré in the cafe. I myself am a rather young god. My experience, perhaps there's not much to say, but still, my dear girl, I just know I could help you and shine sunlight upon your dark day. No moments to spare, you're in a crunch. You've a break coming up, hardly any time at all. So you powder your nose and head off to lunch, to meet him at a cafe, at a table by the wall. Somewhere far away, trains are flying through the wood, and planes are off course, just why, we don't know. If he should take off, he'll be gone for good. So the answer is simple, just don't let him go. Why are you suddenly quiet, my dear? Just look into his eyes, and do not be shy. I've been closing this circle for many a long year. The one who has brought him to meet you, is I. And she, or someone acting through her, did not let him go. And she, or someone acting through her, fulfilled all his wishes, providing more and more information to confirm his philosophical conclusions. He returned to Russia and submitted the manuscript of his 4th book, Co-Creation, to the publishers. Thus, Vladimir Megré's life really turns out to be like the life of Ivan the Fool in the Russian folktales, the only difference being that the events that happened to Megré are absolutely real. Faced with the reality of such phenomena, we cannot deny the existence of some kind of forces capable of purposefully influencing the destiny of an individual man. This begs a number of questions. Are these forces capable of influencing the destiny of all mankind? How active have these forces been in the past? Have they become more active in our century? What kind of forces are they? The events we have witnessed suggest the need to pay more careful attention to Anastasia's sayings. My dear colleagues, the majority of our research group is inclined toward the following conclusion. The Siberian recluse Anastasía, while leaving the governments of the different countries in position for the time being, is actually taking personal control of the whole human civilization. Note the distinction, not seizing power, but taking personal control. Upon coming into contact with Megré's books, the majority of readers experience a desire to change their way of life. His readers already number more than 1 million, and their numbers are steadily growing. Once they have reached a critical mass, they will be capable of influencing the decisions of the world's governments. But even today, in these governments, there are to be found enthusiastic supporters of the conclusions reached in the books. In other words, our society as a whole will become just as controllable as Vladimir Megré himself. I hope there is no longer any doubt in your minds, my dear colleagues, that this Megré is an entity completely under the control of some kind of forces. I believe it is incumbent upon us, through our joint efforts, to figure out just who the Siberian recluse Anastasía is. Where is she, anyway? What are her capabilities? What kind of forces are helping her? Where are they trying to lead our society? These are the questions that modern science must answer.